I've been in the meat industry for a number of years. I understand it, I know what happens in it, and I also know what happens in it that shouldn't happen. Unfortunately, 2020 is probably one of the most interesting years that our lifetime will ever experience. And I'm hoping that, because I'm hoping it's not going to get weirder going forward. But unfortunately, we live in a time where people need to make sure that they are protected. And this really goes out to employers. As an employer, you have at some stage been called something, probably not something good. And it's based on the way in which you handled the situation, or the way in which you handled an employee, or the way in which you dismissed an employee, or whatever the case may be, but you definitely did something wrong in somebody's eyes. And unfortunately, people are so desperate nowadays that they will literally do anything to get their hands on money, especially in the times where there's a lot of desperation. And whilst there's a lot of work out there, there's also a lot of laziness, because people, for the most part, want the money, but they don't want to work for it. I know for a fact, and if you're watching this, you will know this as well, that the meat industry it's so understaffed that it's not even funny. The availability of skilled people is so lacking that it is actually quite shocking. As an industry, we are busy killing ourselves. And it really is the time that we start doing something about this and making sure that we train people, and we train them for the right reasons. Now, if we look at the end goal, and the end goal being the consumer in mind, we need to, in these interesting times, find ways in which to engage with our customers and our clients, and to make sure that they understand that we understand the importance of food safety, and that we as employers are taking every single measure possible to make sure that these consumers are being looked after. And that is why it's important for you to make sure that you are food compliant. There is legislation in place, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and its regulations. And I know what you might say. Yeah, I'm compliant with the Health and Safety Act because I've got the safety file and I've had the risk assessments done. And either you do it yourself or you've outsourced it to somebody else. But the reality is that I can guarantee you that there is virtually no individual within South Africa that can safely say that they have a compliance certificate to say that they can operate, for example, a bandsaw. Now, a person might be able to operate the bandsaw, and I'm not going to dispute that. But the problem is there's very little in the form of proof. So if something goes wrong, which inevitably it's going to, if something goes wrong, as an employer, you are going to need to find some form of proof. And, unfortunately, compliance is very much like insurance. It's a grudge purchase. It's not something that you want to do, but unfortunately the attitude needs to change, and you need to want to do it because it's for the benefit of your employee, so as to make sure that they're trained adequately and they're not going to hurt themselves, or at least they're not going to be negligent about their actions and then hurt themselves. You are ultimately looking after the consumer and making sure that the practices within your workplace is of such a nature that the consumer can trust when they buy from you. But you also look after yourself as an employer because you mitigate your risk as far as possible. And that is really the best thing that you can do for yourself. And we're heading into the festive season, and really compliance and that little bit of insurance is really the best thing that you can buy yourself or give yourself for Christmas, especially going forward. We live in desperate times where people will come into a workplace and they will hurt themselves just to be able to get money and not have to work for it. So how does that work? So if, for example, an employee gets hurt, you decide you want to take on a new employee, the person gets hurt, and there's an investigation because ultimately the person needs to go to the hospital, there's medical help involved. If the person has been found negligent and they do an investigation and they find out that the person or the employee hasn't been trained and there's no proof of training to be given, unfortunately, as much as wherever there's legislation involved, you as an employer will be held liable and accountable. If you look at the Tax Act, for example, it states in there that ultimately the taxpayer is the responsible individual or party. They need to account for whatever happens. And the same goes when the Compensation Commissioner conducts investigations and checking whether people have been trained. And that could potentially spark a different kind of investigation. The Department of Labour could come in and they could conduct an investigation or a site visit and start determining how compliant you are with health and safety legislation. And if you're found to be non-compliant, you are going to be given some time to fix it, but unfortunately, together with all the other things that you need to do, you actually don't need this drama in your life. So if there is a site visit, and also when, because we see now that with the being under the Disaster Management Act, the government has been really proactive in putting measures in place to try and protect people and employees in the workplace and ultimately consumers. So one of the regulations state that if you have a certain number of employees, you need to have a compliance officer in place. And you know what's coming. You know there's going to be an investigation. There's going to be a site visit. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. They're going to come out. They're going to check whether you have these regulations or conform to the regulations. And you are going to get into trouble if, unfortunately, you are not compliant. So therefore, it's in your best interest to make sure that you have your insurance in place. Make sure your people are compliant. And because it's ultimately for, if you need to be selfish, it's for your own benefit. If you want to get in touch with us, I'll leave a link in the description below. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you and making sure that together we look after the safety of people for everybody's benefit.